Individual contributors to classical liberalism and political liberalism are associated with philosophers of the Enlightenment. Liberalism as a specifically named ideology begins in the late 18th century as a movement towards self-government and away from aristocracy. It included the ideas of self-determination, the primacy of the individual and a nation, as opposed to the state and religion, as being the fundamental units of law, politics and economy. Since then, liberalism has broadened to include a wide range of approaches from Americans Ronald Dworkin, Richard Rorty, John Rawls and Francis Fukuyama, as well as the Indian Amartya Sen and the Peruvian Hernando de Soto. Some of these people moved away from liberalism, while others espoused other ideologies before turning to liberalism. There are many different views of what constitutes liberalism, and some liberals would feel that some of the people on this list were not true liberals. It is intended to be suggestive rather than exhaustive. Theorists whose ideas were mainly typical for one country should be listed in that country's section of liberalism worldwide. Generally, only thinkers are listed. Politicians are only listed when they, beside their active political work, also made substantial contributions to liberal theory. Classical contributors to liberalism. Aristotle is revered among political theorists for his seminal work Politics. He made invaluable contributions to liberal theory through his observations on different forms of government and the nature of man. He begins with the idea that the best government provides an active and happy life for its people. Aristotle then considers 6 forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and polity on one side as good forms of government, and tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy as bad forms. Considering each in turn, Aristotle rejects monarchy as infantilizing of citizens, oligarchy as too profit-motivated, tyranny as against the will of the people, democracy as serving only to the poor, and aristocracy as ideal but ultimately impossible. Aristotle finally concludes that a polity, a combination between democracy and oligarchy, where most can vote but must choose among the rich and virtuous for governors, is the best compromise between idealism and realism. In addition, Aristotle was a firm supporter of private property. He refuted Plato's argument for a collectivist society in which family and property are held in common. Aristotle makes the argument that when one's own son or land is rightfully one's own, one puts much more effort into cultivating that item, to the ultimate betterment of society. He references barbarian tribes of his time in which property was held in common, and the laziest of the bunch would always take away larger amounts of food grown by the most diligent. Humanism. Niccolo Machiavelli, best known for his Il Principe, was the founder of realist political philosophy, advocated republican government, citizen armies, division of power, protection of personal property, and restraint of government expenditure as being necessary to the liberties of a republic. He wrote extensively on the need for individual initiative, virtù, as an essential characteristic of stable government. He argued that liberty was the central good which government should protect, and that good people would make good laws, whereas people who had lost the virtue could maintain the liberties only with difficulty. His discourses on Livy outlined realism as the central idea of political study and favored republics over principalities. Anti-statist liberals consider Machiavelli's distrust is his main message, noting his call for a strong state under a strong leader, who should use any means to establish his position, whereas liberalism is an ideology of individual freedom and voluntary choices. Contributing literature. Il Principe, 1513. Discorsi sopra la prima decada di Tito Livio, 1512–1517. Desiderius or Erasmus. Desiderius Erasmus was an advocate of the doctrine now known as humanism, critic of entrenched interests, or irrationality and superstition. are Erasmusian societies formed across Europe, to some extent in response to the turbulence of the Reformation. He dealt with the freedom of the will, a crucial point. In his De Libero Arbitrio diatribe Sive Collatio, he analyzes with great cleverness and good humor the Lutheran exaggeration of the obvious limitations on human freedom. Contributing literature Stultitia Laus, 1509 De Libero Arbitrio diatribe Sive Collatio, 1524. Thomas Hobbes theorized that government is the result of individual actions and human traits, and that it was motivated primarily by interest, a term which would become crucial in the development of a liberal theory of government and political economy, since it is the foundation of the idea that individuals can be self-governing and self-regulating. His work Leviathan did not advocate this viewpoint, but instead that only a strong government could restrain unchecked interest. It did, however, advance a proto-liberal position in arguing for an inalienable right of nature, the right to defend oneself, even against the state. Though it is problematic to classify Hobbes himself as a liberal, his work influenced Locke, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison and many other later liberals, leading Strauss to identify Hobbes as the father of liberalism. Contributing literature Leviathan, 1651. Baruch Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza is in his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus and Tractatus Politicus a proto-liberal defending the value of separation of church and state as well as forms of democracy. In the first mentioned book, Spinoza expresses an early criticism of religious intolerance and a defense of secular government. Spinoza was a thoroughgoing determinist who held that absolutely everything that happens occurs through the operation of necessity. For him, even human behavior is fully determined, freedom being our capacity to know we are determined and to understand why we act as we do. So freedom is not the possibility to say no to what happens to us, but the possibility to say yes and fully understand why things should necessarily happen that way. Contributing literature Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, 1670. Tractatus Politicus, 1677. From Locke to Mill. John Locke's notion that a government with the consent of the governed, and man's natural rights, life, liberty, and a state as well on tolerance, as laid down in a letter concerning toleration and two treatises of government, had an enormous influence on the development of liberalism. Developed a theory of property resting on the actions of individuals, rather than on descent or nobility. Some literature. A letter concerning toleration, 1689. The second treatise of civil government, 1689. John Trenchard. John Trenchard was co-author, with Thomas Gordon, of Cato's Letters. These newspaper essays condemn tyranny and advanced principles of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, and remain vehicle for spreading the concepts that had been developed by John Locke. Some literature. Cato's Letters, John Trenchard and Amp. Thomas Gordon, 1720–1723. Charles de Montesquieu. Charles de Montesquieu. In the spirit of the laws, Montesquieu expanded the separation of powers in government and society. In government, Montesquieu encouraged division into the now standard legislative, judicial and executive branches. In society, he perceived a natural organization into king, the people and the aristocracy, with the latter playing a mediating role. I do not write to censor that which is established in any country whatsoever. Montesquieu disclaimed in the laws. However, he did pay special attention to what he felt was the positive example of the constitutional system in England, which in spite of its evolution toward a fusion of powers, had moderated the power of the monarch, and divided Parliament along class lines. Montesquieu's work had a seminal impact on the American and French revolutionaries. Ironically, the least liberal element of his thought that his privileging of the aristocracy was belied by both revolutions. Montesquieu's system came to fruition in America, a country with no aristocracy. In France, political maneuvering by the aristocracy led to the convocation of the 1789 Estates General and Popular Revolt. Some literature. De l'esprit des lois, 1748. Encyclopédie Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, 1751–1772. Thomas Gordon. Thomas Gordon was co-author with John Trenchard of Cato's Letters. These newspaper essays condemn tyranny and advanced principles of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, and were a main vehicle for spreading the concepts that had been developed by John Locke. Some literature. Cato's Letters, John Trenchard and Amp. Thomas Gordon, 1720–1723. François Quesnay. Some literature. Encyclopédie Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, 1751–1772. Voltaire. Some literature. Lettres philosophiques sur les Anglais, 1734. Encyclopédie Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, 1751–1772. Essai sur l'histoire générale et sur les mots et l'esprit des nations, 1756. Traité sur la tolérance à l'occasion de la mort de Jean Calas, 1763. Dictionnaire philosophique, 1764. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Some literature on the social contract, 1762. Denis Diderot. Some literature. Encyclopédie Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, 1751–1772. Jean-Laurent d'Alembert. Some literature. Encyclopédie Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, 1751–1772. Richard Price. Some literature. Observations on civil liberty and the justice and policy of the war with America, 1776. Anders Chydenius, 1729–1803. His book Den Nationale Winston proposed roughly same the ideas as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, a decade earlier, including foundations of liberalism and capitalism and the invisible hand. He demanded complete economic and individual freedom, including the freedom of religion, workers' rights to freely move and choose the professions and employers, the freedom of speech and trade, and abolitions of all privileges and price and wage controls. He was also a member of the Swedish Four Estates Parliament, elected 3 times as representative of the clergy in the northern and western parts of Finland. In his first parliamentary session, 1765–66, he was very successful as a member of the subcommittee that wrote Sweden's famous constitutional law of the freedom of printing, Tryckfrihetsförordningen of 1766. In this law, Chydenius combined freedom of the press and abolishment of the political censorship, with free access for the citizens to most government documents. Chydenius' liberal system, where transparency reinforces press freedom, and the right for everyone to print the public document reinforces transparency, has been a fundamental constitutional principle in Sweden ever since, except for the years of royal autocracy 1772–1809. Chydenius' model for press freedom and freedom of information was re-established and strengthened in the Swedish Constitution 1809. It is now the foundation of the present Tryckfrihetsförordningen of 1949, which is one of the fundamental laws of Sweden. In diluted form, and without the strong constitutional protection of the Swedish free press model, The principle of free access to public documents that originated in Chydenius' law of 1766, has in recent decades been spread from Sweden to the Freedom of Information Acts of many countries. This way, Anders Chydenius has become one of the older liberal thinkers that has most practical influence on politics and public administration of modern Western societies. An edition of Anders Chydenius' complete works, in Finnish, Swedish and English, is under preparation by the Chydenius Foundation in Finland. Some literature. Americans Beta, 1753. Callan till Ricketts 1 Magt, 1765. Der National Winston, 1765. Adam Smith, often considered the founder of modern economics, was a key figure in formulating and advancing economic doctrine of free trade and competition. In his Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith outlined the key idea that if the economy is basically left to its own devices, limited and finite resources will be put to ultimately the most efficient use through people acting purely in the self-interest. This concept has been quoted out of context by later economists as the invisible hand of the market. Smith also advanced property rights and personal civil liberties, including stopping slavery, which today partly formed the basic liberal ideology. He was also opposed to stock-holding companies, what today is called a corporation, because he predicated the self-policing of the free market upon the free association of moral individuals. Some literature. An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759. Immanuel Kant. Some literature. Grundlagen zur Metaphysik der Sitten, 1785. Kritik der praktischen Vernunft, 1788. Über den Gemeinspruch, das mag in der Theorie richtig sein, tut aber nicht für die Praxis, 1793. Zum Urchen Frieden, 1795. Metaphysik der Sitten, 1797. Unrobage acteur got some literature. Lettres sur la liberté du commerce des grains, 1770. Joseph Priestley. Some literature. Observations on civil liberty and the nature and justice of the war with America, 1772. August Ludwig von Schlosser. Patrick Henry. Some literature. Liberty at Death, 1775. Thomas Paine. Some literature. Rights of Man, 1791 to 1792. Agrarian Justice, 1797. Thomas Jefferson was the third President of the United States and author of the Declaration of Independence. He also wrote notes on the state of Virginia and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. He was a champion of inalienable individual rights and the separation of church and state. His ideas were repeated in many other liberal revolutions around the world, including the French Revolution. Marquis de Condorcet. Some literature. Esquisse d'un tableau historique des progrès de l'esprit humain, 1795. Jeremy Bentham, an early advocate of utilitarianism, animal welfare and women's rights. He had many students all around the world, including John Stuart Mill and several political leaders. Bentham demanded economic and individual freedom, including the separation of the state and church, freedom of expression, completely equal rights for women, the end of slavery and colonialism, uniform democracy, the abolition of physical punishment, also in children, the right for divorce, free prices, free trade and no restrictions on interest. Bentham was not a libertarian. He supported inheritance tax, restrictions on monopoly power, pensions, health insurance and other social security, but called for prudence and careful consideration in any such governmental intervention. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès played an important role in the opening years of the French Revolution, drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, expanding on the theory of national sovereignty, popular sovereignty, and representation implied in his pamphlet What is the Third Estate? Antoine de Tracy and Louise Germain de Staël. Some literature appelle aux souverains à écouter unis à Paris pour en obtenir l'abolition de la traite des nègres 1814. Benjamin Constant. Some literature, the liberty of ancients compared with that of moderns 1816. Jean-Baptiste Say. Some literature, Traité d'Economie.Politique 1803. Wilhelm von Humboldt. Some literature, Ideen zu einem Versuch die Grenzen der Wirksamkeit des Staates zu bestimmen 1792. David Ricardo. James Mill. Some literature, Elements of Political Economy 1821. Frédéric Bastiat. Claude Frédéric Bastiat was a French classical liberal theorist, political economist, a member of the French Assembly. He was notable for developing the important economic concept of opportunity cost. Some literature, C. Equorn Voigt par 1850. Johann Rudolf Thorbecke. The Dutch statesman Johann Rudolf Thorbecke was the main theorist of Dutch liberalism in the 19th century, outlining a more democratic alternative to the absolute monarchy, the constitutional monarchy. The Constitution of 1848 was mainly his work. His main theoretical article, specifically labeled as liberal, was Over het Hendaarsche Staatsburgerschap from 1844. He became Prime Minister in 1849, thus starting numerous fundamental reforms in Dutch politics. Harriet Martineau. Some literature, The Martyrage of the United States 1839. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson was an American philosopher who argued that the basic principles of government were mutable, and that government is required only insofar as people are not self-governing. Proponent of democracy, and of the idea that a democratic people must have a democratic ethics. Some literature, Self-Reliance, Circles, Politics, the Nominalist and the Realist. Alexis de Tocqueville. Some literature, De la démocratie en Amérique 1831–1840. L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution 1856. William Lloyd Garrison. Some literature, articles advocating abolition of slavery in the newspaper The Liberator 1831–1866. Friedrich Schiller.